evening. Everyone can hear me fine? Yes? You want to try it? Make sure our mics are working here?
Yeah. Hello. Is it working?
Yes, we're working. Okay, wonderful. My name is Robert Myers, and I'm the director of the Center for American Studies and Research. We're extremely pleased with the Center for Arab and Middle East Studies to be sponsoring tonight's talk. Before we begin, I'd like to simply let you know about a couple of things that we'll be doing in the spring very quickly, and then I'll introduce tonight's guest. On March the 9th, Richard Kamen, who's an attorney for Guantanamo inmate Abdul Rahim al-Nashri, will be here. Followed the following week also by a counsel from another Guantanamo inmate, Amar al-Baluchi. We owe Lisa Hajar, who's our Edward Said chair at CASLA this year, a great deal of thanks for connecting us with these very interesting perspectives of attorneys from Guantanamo. The following week, 18th through 25th, there will be a production that's produced by AV, a play by the Syrian playwright Sadal Wanus Al-Ittisab. This will be the first English language production of the play. I'm the producer of the play. But as you'll see, I think it has a great connection with what we'll be discussing tonight and in March. It's about the use of rape as a tool of interrogation by the Israeli Shin Bet during the first Intifada. Please keep an eye out for that. There'll be publicity for that. As well as a conference on Sadal Wanus, the playwright who wrote that play and a number of other very significant plays on April 1st at Issam Ferris Auditorium. And finally, Anjali Nath, who's also a faculty member at the Center for American Studies and Research, is one of the organizers of a conference on April 8th and 9th called Decolonial Provocations, Thinking Coloniality in the Global South, Comparative Colonialism. So those are some of the upcoming events. Now I have the enormous pleasure to introduce tonight's guest. James Bamford is a columnist for Foreign Policy magazine, as well as an American best-selling author, journalist, and documentary producer. He's widely noted for his writing about the United States intelligence agencies, especially the highly secretive National Security Agency. The New York Times has called him, quote, the nation's premier journalist on the subject of the National Security Agency. And in a lengthy profile, which I've provided copies for you, it's quite interesting. The New Yorker referred to him as, quote, the NSA's chief chronicler. His most recent book, The Shadow Factory, the Ultra-Secret NSA From 9/11 to the Eavesdropping on America, became a New York Times bestseller and was named by the Washington Post as one of the best books of the year. It is the third in a trilogy by Mr. Bamford on the NSA, following The Puzzle Palace in 1982, when people thought NSA stood for no such agency, and Body of Secrets, 2001, also New York Times bestsellers. This past September, he wrote a cover story for Wired magazine based on his 3 days in Moscow with fugitive NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden, the longest any journalist has spent with him there. In addition, and I should say that I passed out also an editorial from the New York Times, which was in part extracted from that interview. In addition, he's written for the New York Review of Books, New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic, Harper's, Rolling Stone, and many other publications. In 2006, he won the National Magazine Award for reporting, the highest honor in the magazine industry, for his writing in Rolling Stone on the war in Iraq, and I highly recommend Pretext for a War, his book about the Iraq War, if you've not read it. He also writes and produces documentaries for PBS, including The Spy Factory, based on his most recent book, which was nominated for an Academy Award in 2010. And he is currently working on a new documentary for PBS on cyber warfare, which is scheduled to air early next year. Tonight's talk is called Everyone's a Target: NSA's Mass Surveillance and Cyber Warfare in the Middle East. James Bamford, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thanks, Robert. It's really great to be here. Last time I was here, I actually had some hair. It was 1972, so it's been a long time, but it's great getting back to Beirut. As Robert was saying, I spent some time with Ed Snowden last summer in Moscow, and when I started writing about NSA back in 1982, the old joke was that NSA stood for no such agency, or if you were inside the agency, the joke was it stood for never say anything. And then I was telling Snowden, last time I was up at NSA, the joke now is NSA stands for not secret anymore. And he got a big kick out of that. So it was really fascinating hanging out with him. It was a bit bizarre since I had to do everything on an encrypted computer, and I had to fly there not knowing exactly when or where I was going to meet him, and then I was told I had to go to a certain place and sit in a certain location and read a certain book, and then he would come by and he would see me. The funny thing was he walked by me and didn't even see I was there, so I had to get up and say hello to him, and I told him that I thought you were in the CIA. I thought you'd be able to spot me like that, and he got a big kick out of that. We went upstairs and had a pizza, and I spent 3 days listening to why he wanted to be a whistleblower and sort of change his life. And I really came away admiring him for virtually giving up everything. He lived in Hawaii, he had a $120,000 a year income, beautiful girlfriend, and he gave it all up to tell the world what NSA was doing. So I had a great deal of admiration for him. So I'd be happy to answer questions about Snowden, but what I wanted to do today is just get a little bit of what happened in the United States is when Snowden's information came out, there was enormous discussions for at least a year or so. It's still going on to some degree, but it was all focused on what NSA was doing within the United States with U.S. citizens and so forth. So I thought it'd be interesting here to talk about the other aspect. What about NSA spying on the rest of the world, on Lebanon and everybody else in other countries? And that's an area that really hasn't been talked about and really needs to be talked about in the United States. One of the things when I was with Snowden, we did have a few things in common. I'll give you a little background about how I got into this area of writing about this topic, a fairly unusual topic. Snowden and I had a few things in common. He was at a secret NSA facility in Hawaii, and I was also at a secret facility in Hawaii. I was in the Navy, and luckily I got off the plane one stop before Vietnam. During the Vietnam War, I got off in Hawaii, so the only danger was dodging surfboards. I spent 3 years there, and it was at a time when NSA was very, very secret. Nobody knew anything about it. That was me with my little motorcycle gang there. But what NSA, and this was after the Navy, I went on the GI Bill. I went to law school. And while I was in law school, I stayed in the Navy Reserves. That's, you do like 1 weekend a month, and then you spend 2 weeks active duty. So they sent me to this little place called Sabana Seca. It was a listening post, an NSA listening post. And it was in Puerto Rico, and it was focused on the Caribbean and Central America and South America. It was mostly listening to basically Cuba, I think, was the #1 target. Anyway, I was there for 2 weeks. I didn't really want to do too much work, and I was just sort of hanging out. I didn't really speak much Spanish. And then somebody called me over and said, do you want to listen to something? And I said, I didn't really know much Spanish. So they said, well, it's in English, so you don't have to worry about it. So I put the earphones on, and lo and behold, there were Americans talking to each other. And I thought that was rather odd, since I was in my third year in law school, and I knew we had to get warrants if we wanted to listen to Americans. I was actually a voluntary prosecutor, so I knew what the procedure was. So I thought it was rather odd. But what I didn't know was at the time, NSA had a very secret operation going on. It was Operation Minaret. And it was eavesdropping on American citizens. This was under the Nixon administration. And they were really targeting very dangerous people in the United States. One of them was Jane Fonda. Another was Dr. Benjamin Spock. He had his weapon there. Muhammad Ali, and Dr. Martin Luther King. So these were some of the targets. These were people that were anti-war, and that was what Nixon was all about. So he was targeting these people, and he got NSA to begin eavesdropping on them. And so when I was listening to those conversations, that's actually what this was part of. But when I got back to Boston, where I was going to law school, another thing was going on. It was a church committee. The church committee was this committee that was set up to investigate all the abuses. For the first time, a committee set up to investigate the intelligence community by Congress to look into the abuses of NSA, CIA, and all the rest. So I did a rather unusual thing. I decided I'd call them up and become a whistleblower and tell them that NSA is actually listening to Americans down in Puerto Rico. And this was, let me just move it. Yeah, this was the Senator Frank Church has that gun there. It was actually a CIA dart gun used, I think, in their assassination program or something. So I called up the committee, and they said, how fast can you get down to Washington? Because they were really surprised to hear that NSA was still doing this. NSA told them they had stopped this a year and a half earlier. So I flew down to Washington and told Frank Church in executive session, and he was rather amazed that the NSA was doing this behind behind the committee's back. And so I spent a few days down there testifying, and it was all behind closed doors, so I didn't have my name revealed. But that gave me the idea to write the first book about NSA. When I graduated from law school, I didn't really want to practice law that much, so I decided to write the very first book about NSA, which was The Puzzle Palace. And there were some very unhappy people at NSA that I decided to write this book. I took some pictures of them. They were rather annoyed that I wrote a book about their agency. And what they did was they actually threatened me with prosecution twice under the espionage statute, because I got a document from the Justice Department under the Freedom of Information Act that was basically NSA's criminal file that had been released to me by the Justice Department. And when NSA found out that I had it, they demanded I give it back, because they said they reclassified it as top secret. It was unclassified when I got it, but then they said, well, now it's top secret, so you have to give it back. I refused to give it back, and there was a fairly big battle. I went ahead and published the information, but they never did prosecute me. We did find it was actually good going to law school. We found an actual loophole that got me out of going to jail, so that was very good. Now, let me just give you a little background of NSA. This is where it all began. It began in this little townhouse on the east side of Manhattan. 1920, it was called the Black Chamber back then. And the first floor was just a cover. They made codes, commercial codes. It was just a cover. And then the middle two floors were where they were doing the actual analysis of the intercepts and all that stuff. And on the top floor was where Herbert Yardley lived. He was the chief of the Black Chamber. So it got a very modest start there in 1920. And this is NSA today. It's an entire city. It has 32 miles of road. There's 37,000 cars registered there. I mean, it's a giant city. You can't see it. It's actually halfway between Baltimore and Washington. But if you're driving down that road, you can't see it. It's hidden behind trees. Then beyond that are all the fences and the anti-tank devices and everything else. This is this is a picture of the headquarters, and the headquarters. You could put the U.S. Capitol in 4 times over. It's an enormous agency. NSA is the largest intelligence agency on Earth, and it's been that way for quite a while. So the CIA gets most, or at least before Snowden, the CIA was the one that got all the attention, but the NSA was the one that really produced most of the intelligence. And because I've been doing this so long, and I've had numerous legal battles with NSA, and I've won actually most of them, luckily, and one of those required them giving me a tour of the agency, believe it or not. So I'm one of the few people who's actually been through the agency several times. And I was able to take some pictures in there. I'll show you what it looks like in there. This is what NSA looks like inside. These are the people at work. Now, they really didn't let me in with a camera, so I had to sort of make this up. But that's sort of like what it looks like, a little bit. Anyway, this is one of Snowden's top secret documents that was released. Until he released documents, nobody knew what the budget was. But that's the budget. It's really a large budget, $52 billion for the entire intelligence community. The NSA gets $10 billion of that money. The CIA always used to be below the NSA in terms of the amount of money it would get, because all it did was recruit spies. You know, all you do is buy them a drink or something. But now they've got all their drones. They're buying all these drones. So all of a sudden, the CIA is spending more money than the NSA. Well, this slide here is basically where everything changed. This is a house in Yemen, right outside of Yemen, or right outside of Sana'a. And I was with a PBS crew. We went there as part of this documentary I was doing for PBS on the 9/11 attacks, and then the NSA's failure in the 9/11 attack. So what this is the bin Laden's operational center. This is where everything happened. It didn't really happen in Afghanistan. I mean, bin Laden was up there. He had his phone. He had this phone here. It was a satellite phone, and he would call this house in Yemen. And this is where all the planning was done for the attack on the Uss Cole, on the attack on the East Embassy bombings, and also on the 9/11 attack. And bin Laden would use that phone, and it was an Inmarsat well, it was a satellite phone connected to Inmarsat. And that's his phone number. If you want to call it, he's not around. You can get his answering service, I think. But this is a Khalid al-Mihdhar. Now, he was married to the daughter of the person who owned that house. And the way 9/11 began, basically, was NSA eavesdropped on that house. The NSA had been eavesdropping on that house for years. And those phone calls were unencrypted. Bin Laden didn't have an encryption system on that phone. So they were all unencrypted, but he never said anything really important. So even though they were listening to the phone calls, the attacks were taking place in East Africa and so forth, and they completely missed it. Well, the most important call they picked up was in December of 1999. It was a call from Afghanistan, either bin Laden or Khalid Sheikh Mohammed or somebody called up and said, send Khalid and Nawaf to Kuala Lumpur for the meeting. So all of a sudden that rang a bunch of bells at the NSA. The NSA contacted the CIA and said there's a big meeting taking place. There's 2 key people that bin Laden's sending from from his operational center in Sana'a to Kuala Lumpur. And the CIA went to, let me put his name there. The CIA went to Kuala Lumpur and staked it out, and they had the Malaysian government help them there. The problem was when they were following these people around, particularly Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi. They were the two people sent by bin Laden. They went to the airport at one point, and they got on an airplane. The problem was the CIA people that were doing the following didn't have their passports with them, so they couldn't get on a plane and follow them. But they did the next best thing. They called, they knew where the plane was going. It was going to Bangkok. So they called the CIA station in Bangkok and to tell them to, when this plane gets in, watch these people, watch them, see where they're going. The problem was it was Saturday and nobody was working at the CIA station in Bangkok. So they got off the plane in Bangkok and disappeared, and that was it. A couple days later, they got on a plane and they flew to Los Angeles. They had a visa in their passports, and the CIA knew they had visas in their passports because when they went from Yemen to Kuala Lumpur, they passed through Dubai, and Dubai government was cooperating with the CIA, so they photographed their passports when they went through customs there, or when they went through passport control. And then the Dubai government sent the passports, copies of the passports, to the CIA station, and then they forwarded it to Washington to the CIA bin Laden unit. It was called Alex Station. So they had the information that these two guys had visas going to the United States. It's rather odd. These guys, were just being sent by bin Laden to a secret meeting, and they've got a visa to the United States, rather important. The FBI, two FBI agents that were there, wanted to tell the FBI agents in Washington headquarters that these guys had these visas, and the CIA wouldn't let them do that. They refused to allow the FBI to know that these guys had the visa. In addition to that, Mike Scheuer was head of the bin Laden unit at the time, and he kept trying to get the NSA to give him the information that was going into that house, or coming out of that house in Yemen. And the NSA continued to refuse to give the CIA the information that was going into the bin Laden house. They tried 3 times, and finally the CIA built their own little listening post to try to pick up the signals. But they were only getting half the conversation because they were only getting the downlink. The CIA didn't have a eavesdropping satellite up there, the NSA did. So they didn't get they only got half the conversations. And these are 2 agencies that are supposed to be cooperating. So what happened was these guys got to the United States, and they ended up in San Diego, and then they decided to go across the country. They were getting prepared to attack the Pentagon. This was Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi, the 2 guys that were being sent from Yemen originally. So they had their crew now, and now they set up their temporary facility, their temporary headquarters about 6 weeks before the attack. And they picked this little motel in Laurel, Maryland, which is very interesting because the other thing in Laurel, Maryland is the National Security Agency. It's only about 2 miles away, and I've actually been in the director's office a number of times. And that window right behind General Alexander, you could almost see that motel. It's up on the 8th floor of the NSA, and so they didn't know about it. They were actually going to the same gyms that these guys were working out in. So for the time leading up to 9/11, they were looking for the terrorists, but they were right across the street, basically. So instead of learning about it through all the billions of dollars of electronic equipment that NSA has, they learned about it from that little television set right next to the director's office. I think it's about a $250 television set And they had it tuned to CNN, and they happened to see 9/11 happen. So that's how NSA learned about 9/11. So after 9/11, you had President Bush decided to go into warrantless eavesdropping, begin eavesdropping on American citizens without a warrant. And the NSA was the organization that was set up to obviously do all of that. So, you know, Bush decided that the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, which has never had a leak in its entire history, couldn't be trusted with this information. So he bypassed the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court and began the eavesdropping. Now, like I said, a lot of this has been discussed in the United States. And so what I wanted to do was discuss a little bit about the other topic, which is how outside the United States, everybody's a target. There are no restrictions. In the United States, you do have some restrictions. They're usually violated, but there are restrictions, and the amount of spying is fairly limited compared to the amount of spying they do outside the United States. So when it comes, and this topic is almost never talked about in the United States because you know, nobody really cares what the NSA does outside. But that's, like I said, what I think might be interesting to talk about tonight. So Michael Hayden used to be the director of the NSA. He was, I've known him for a long time. He was the director when I was writing one of my books, Body of Secrets. I mean, I've actually had a sort of love-hate relationship with NSA. They threatened me twice with prosecution under the espionage statute, my first book. And my second book, Body of Secrets, they actually had a book signing for me at NSA. So, you know, it sort of goes both ways. And Hayden was the director back in those days, so I got to know him. And so after 9/11, he was the person who decided to have the, turn the NSA on the American public and so forth. And one of the quotes that he said that I thought was really important or really interesting was that he said, when you look at the United States sort of sits in the center of all communications. If you look at where all these cables go, the undersea cables, they all sort of pass through the United States. No matter where they are in the world, eventually they pass through the United States. And same with the internet, because you have all the internet companies here in the United States. That's where all the internet comes in. So that made NSA very happy, obviously, and Michael Hayden came out with an interesting quote, we have the home field advantage, which is very true. So as a result of that, the NSA began, General Alexander took over after Hayden, and the whole idea was to collect it all. That was the idea. To collect everything, and then you search through it. So you basically, what you do is build this enormous haystack of data. You collect everything in the world, and then put it in this haystack, and then you can search through it. And that was called Stellar Wind. That was the name of the program. That was NSA's program for doing the domestic eavesdropping, and to a large degree, it was also on eavesdropping on people around the world. Now, when you speak about NSA, you can't just talk about NSA because it's actually a big organization. It's not just NSA. It's what's known as the Five Eyes. That's what they sort of call themselves, although I never really understood that. I always thought they should be called the 10 Ears, since that's what they're doing is eavesdropping. This is actually another top secret slide that came from Snowden, and it shows who NSA's partners are. The Five Eyes are the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK. They're the organizations that largely did the work during the World War II on breaking German, Japanese codes and so forth. So they formed this organization after World War II, and they've been together ever since. Now you have third parties who are also cooperating with NSA. They have less privileges, and they're not as they don't have quite the access to NSA, but the second parties are the ones that have the most access. The way that it works is because you have those parties, you're able to divide the world up into spheres of eavesdropping influence, basically. So if the United States wants something from Europe or Russia, the British GCHQ can do that very easily from the UK. If the Brits want something from South America, we could do that very easy because of our geography and so forth. So they divided up the world so everybody listens to a certain part of it, so there's not a lot of duplication. And what they do afterwards is they share everything. So it's like they all do all this eavesdropping on different parts of the world, and they put it into a big vat, and then everybody has access to it. One of the other interesting things was the NSA had a lot of cooperation with the Israelis. The NSA has had a great deal of cooperation with them. They, one of the things I wrote about for the New York Times not too long ago, I think last September, was the fact that the NSA, one of the things Snowden told me when I was in Moscow was that NSA not only gave information to the Israelis, but they gave the information without ever making any redactions, without ever taking any individual names out, even in the United States. So you could have Palestinians that would be working, that would be making phone calls to relatives in the occupied territories and so forth, and you know, they think, or they're sending emails or whatever back and forth, and then NSA takes all that information and gives it to the Israelis. So it was a shock to Snowden, a shock to me too, that they were actually doing this. And then on top of that, what happened last September was that well, NSA's counterpart in Israel is called Unit 8200. That's their NSA. And this is really unprecedented. I mean, this has just never, ever happened. 43 members of their NSA, of their Unit 8200, got up and walked out, basically did what Snowden did. They didn't walk out with any documents, but they walked out and they blew the whistle and said, look, we don't want to work here anymore because NSA is taking all this, Unit 8200 is taking all this information and using it for detrimental purposes on the Palestinians. I mean, they're collecting all the sexual orientations, infidelities, money problems, and so forth, and then using all that information to blackmail the Palestinians in order to get them to cooperate. So you had 43 members. It's never happened in the history, at least that I know of in the world. 43 members of an intelligence agency get up and walk out the door. And these were all Israelis, so they're pretty, you know, they know that they're going to be not get a warm welcome by doing that. So it took a lot of courage to do that. So these are some of the things that were going on with the NSA's eavesdropping. They're taking not only American information, but they're eavesdropping on countries around the world and passing all that to Israel. This slide here, it's one I had before, but what I'm pointing out on this slide is that among the partners of NSA, in addition to Israel, is Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and the UAE. So presumably these countries are sharing information with NSA, and NSA shares information with them, and then NSA takes what Saudi Arabia, Jordan, UAE, and these other countries give them, and then they turn it over to the Israelis. So I don't know if these countries are comprehending that they're actually supplying information to an agency that's passing everything on to the Israelis, but I would think it would come as a fairly big shock to them. So anyway, I wrote this story for the New York Times. I would have thought that the New York Times would have done it themselves, but they didn't. So I ended up doing an op-ed piece, and it got quite a bit of attention in the New York Times. So that's the idea. NSA's begun eavesdropping around the world on everybody's communications. Everybody in here is probably sitting on a cell phone, and that cell phone is connected somewhere, someplace, and NSA probably is getting access to it somehow. So that's what this next section I would like to talk about, is how they do it, basically. So they start, the first thing is satellite communications. You know, if you're talking on a phone and the phone call is going to the US or someplace else, someplace in the world, there's a good chance it's going to go up on a satellite and then bounce down to wherever it's going. And that's why NSA has these listening posts around the world. There are all these radomes, these big golf ball-like things there. Inside each one of those golf balls is a big satellite dish, and it's pointed to one of the communication satellites. So what's coming out of those satellites are telephone calls and emails and all kinds of internet communications, everything. And then they don't have like a spot beam. It just doesn't come down to one point. There's a very big, what they call a footprint for those the beams out of the satellites. So NSA just puts these dishes. There's 3 huge locations around the world where they have these listening posts. This one here is in Menwith Hill Station in England. The idea is you put them on 3 points on the Earth, and then you're able to capture basically all the satellites that orbit the Earth. So there's one in England, there's one in Japan, and one in the United States. Now this is a footprint from Arabsat 5C. It's one of the ones that is used here, I assume, in Lebanon quite a bit. This coverage of that satellite takes in the Lebanon area. So those would be what the NSA is targeting. The NSA is targeting that kind of communications. The NSA has places where they can pick that communications up, and then they sift through it all. This is one of the uplinks in Lebanon, uplinking communications. So if you have a satellite up in space, which is what NSA has lots of, and these are NSA's eavesdropping satellites, and you're catching what those satellites are broadcasting into space. These satellites are in what are known as geostationary orbits. In other words, they're in an orbit 22,300 miles in space, where they are able to sit in a permanent place over one point on the Earth. So they rotate at the same speed that the Earth rotates. So they stay in the same place. And they're able to pick up huge amounts of communications. This next slide here, again, is another top secret slide from Snowden. And what it is what's called foreign sat. That stands for Foreign Satellite Intercept. And these are where NSA has these listening posts around the world. That the ones that were picked, the communications that were going in and out of Lebanon, for example, could be easily picked up in Cyprus, where the GCHQ actually has a big listening post where NSA has people at, or they could maybe pick them up in Oman. But the point is they've got these listening posts all over the world, so they could pick up communications everywhere. And you're talking about lots of communications. An average listening post picks up about 2 million pieces of communications an hour. And you're talking about lots of listening posts. Now another kind of, that's satellite communications. Another kind of communications, I just got this picture off the internet, so I don't know where this building is. Somebody here may recognize it, maybe in Beirut. It's in Lebanon someplace, I assume Beirut. But the reason I put the picture here is because it shows all these antennas on the top. These are microwave antennas, and those antennas are, and some of these, the thin ones there, are cell phone antennas. But the dishes are microwave antennas. And all these are communications. There are cell phone communications, or email, whatever, all kinds of communications, inter-city communications, and they get transferred other places. So this is where it all begins. It begins with going to these local little antennas, and they eventually go to other antennas and eventually go up into space and so forth. Well, microwaves travel in a straight line. They're like a pencil. They just travel in a straight line. And because the Earth is curved, that's an advantage to NSA. Because these signals go straight into space. Since, again, the Earth is curved, the signals go straight. They go off into space. So if you put a satellite in geostationary orbit, you're able to eavesdrop on all those signals, which is what NSA does. That's how they get microwave. So they've gotten the microwave signals, they get the satellite signals. What's next? The next thing is undersea cables. Now that was a big problem for NSA. Picking up the satellite signals are not very difficult, or the microwaves. You just put satellites up there, or you put a big dish someplace. You put a big dish on a military base, or you put it in a friendly country or whatever, so it's not that hard. Undersea cables are more difficult. You can't do that. You actually have to touch the cable somehow. And so what the United States, or what NSA had to start doing in the mid-90s was making secret agreements with the telecom companies, particularly the cable companies. And the reason was because in the 90s is when everybody started communicating on the internet. Before then, the bandwidth didn't have to be that large. You know, people would be calling to Europe occasionally, but there weren't a lot of calls, you know, just a fair amount, but not enough to really warrant enormous amounts of undersea cables. You could do it with the satellites. The problem with the satellite is it's, like I said, 22,300 miles up, so it's and 22,300 miles down, so there's a little bit of a time delay. So when everybody started getting into the internet in the mid-90s, you had enormous amounts of people trying to communicate internationally, particularly trying to communicate to the United States, because that's where Google was and Yahoo and everybody else. So that's when companies started building all these cables undersea. I mean, enormous numbers of cables. They began wrapping the world in all these cables. And again, that was a problem for NSA because NSA had to somehow get access to those cables. And so they began making deals with the telecom companies. Now you can see the advantage here, what Hayden was talking about, that, is that, oh, well, my slides are still going. That's the important thing. What Hayden was talking about at the NSA was that they had the home field advantage, and what you can see here is all these cables going into the United States. I was in Brazil and I gave briefings to some people down there, and they were really astonished when I showed them the slide because they were communicating all over the world, so they thought, you know, their cables are going to Europe or they're going to the Far East. And what they saw was there's only one cable that went to Africa. All the rest went to the United States. And that's basically the way it is for all of South America. So the NSA has a field day because they have access to all that cable, all those cables coming in, NSA can tap because they all go through the United States. And this is a slide of Lebanon's undersea cable system. And eventually these are cable, what they call cable heads or links. And eventually they join other cables, like this Europa, which is I think it's just been built, this brand new one, Europa, and other cables. Now eventually those cables join other cables, and then those other cables end up in the United States. So that's how the world works. So if you're in Lebanon and you see cables, eventually those cables, they're like roads. Eventually they all go to the United States. So that's how NSA is able to get a lot of access to countries around the world. This is another top secret slide from Snowden. It shows how much data, how much information is carried on a single cable. Again, these are fiber optic cables, so what's going through the cable are light beams, photons. And it says here, like one cable can carry 100 million simultaneous conversations. So you're just accessing one cable, you're able to access enormous amounts of information. Now what this cable shows here is very interesting, or what this slide shows is very interesting. It was a secret NSA had been keeping for a long time, how they actually tapped into these fiber optic cables. You can see this little prism here. And what happens if you cut that cable, or you cut the individual little strands within the cable. Again, these are light beams coming out, so you can't really tap them the way you used to do in the old days with a, what they call an induction system. You put a prism there, you put a prism in front of that beam, and the prism splits that into a number of different signals. And that's what NSA does. This is NSA's secret room. What NSA did was they had to get access to these cables. So they made agreements with the telecom companies, particularly like AT&T. And AT&T allowed them to build these secret rooms inside the company. It's that yellow door there. Yes, let there be light. I thought that was NSA for a minute, trying to sabotage my presentation. Would have been the first time. So what NSA did was they built these secret rooms in the telecom companies, like AT&T. And so what happens is those cables, they come in from overseas. And they go into one of the floors. That building on the right is the AT&T switch in San Francisco. It's a 10-story building, hardly any windows. It's all filled with electronic equipment. And that's where all the cables come in. So that from that building there, they all go to wherever they're going, to Kansas, or a telephone call to Kansas, or an email to Boston, or whatever. So what NSA did was they built that secret room, and then when the cables come in, they go through that prism that splits up the beam. So the one part of that beam goes where it's supposed to go to, some grandmother in Kansas City or something. The other beam goes down into that secret room. And then when it goes into that secret room, it goes through all this equipment called NARIS equipment. It's equipment that sifts through all these electronics, sifts through all the communications that are coming in on those beams. Now that equipment, that NARIS equipment, is programmed. It's programmable by NSA at Fort Meade in Maryland. So if all of a sudden they wanted to put James Bamford on the watch list, which wouldn't be out of question, all they would do is type in city at Fort Meade, type in my name, and on this little room, and those rooms all over the country where they have these, the equipment would be looking for my name or my email address or whatever identifiable information they have on all the information that's coming in to that room, coming in and going through it. So it acts as a big filter looking for information. Now they have the same thing in different places around the world also, in cooperating countries. Same thing, same kind of a room, same idea. The information comes in and it gets filtered out. Now, in addition, they have a submarine. Because some of these cables, there are a few cables that actually don't go through the United States, particularly cables that are internal. In other words, a cable that goes from one part of China to another part of China, or from one country that the US has no access to, like Iran or whatever, to maybe another country, North Korea or whatever. So that's why they built this submarine. Interestingly, they picked the USS Jimmy Carter to use as the submarine. So I don't know if Jimmy Carter would have liked it or not, but they took his submarine, the USS Jimmy Carter, and they cut it in half. And they put a big Nsa listening post in it. So it sinks down to the bottom and it taps the cables. Very ingenious. And the NSA, I don't know if they still do, but they used to have, these were undersea bugs. This is the kind of bug that they would actually put on an undersea cable. This was on a cable that was used by the Russians. The Russians had this cable going under the Sea of Okhotsk. And the NSA had a submarine go there and put this tap on it. It's a really big tap. But then there was a spy in the NSA who told the Russians all about it. So the Russians brought it to the surface, and now it's sitting in a museum in Moscow. So it's now on a, you can get a tour of the KGB museum and see their, the NSA's tap. So that's Undersea Cables. Now, another thing the NSA is after, obviously, is internet communications. Every time you send a Google search or whatever, every time you send emails or whatever, that was an enormous effort of the NSA to get access to as much of that as possible. One of the ways they did it was through this program called PRISM. PRISM is a program where you have all these companies, Google and Yahoo, and they've got all my information, probably all of yours too. And it just sits there for quite a while, I don't know, for years probably. And as it's sitting there, NSA can go to the company and under this PRISM program and say, I want all of James Bamford's emails for this period of time or forever, or whatever. And they have to give it to him, and they can't say anything about it. They have to keep it secret. And again, this is another Snowden slide. What it shows is all the companies that were cooperating with NSA and all the companies, the date at which each company began cooperating with NSA. So again, this isn't just, obviously it's not just the US, this is everybody that uses Google anywhere around the world. Has information that's stored there, and then NSA, again, has a home field advantage because Google happens to be located in the United States along with Yahoo and all these other companies. They could just go to them with a legal warrant or whatever and say, I want all this information, give it to me. No other country can do that, but the US can, because they're all located there. But there are times that NSA doesn't even want to go to the front door and ask for the information. They'd rather get it through the back door secretly. And so they came up with this thing called Operation Muscular. And again, this is another top secret slide. And this was a diagram drawn by somebody at NSA. And what happened was that the problem when you're sending a Google search and you just hit the send button on your computer, when it goes to Google, from your computer to Google, it's actually encrypted. And that's one of the reasons why NSA has to go to the company and say, give me all the information. Well, what they found out was when it goes from your computer to Google, it's encrypted, but when Google transmits it between data centers, particularly overseas, it's not encrypted. So NSA was able to get covert access to those cables, either digging them up or bribing somebody or doing something like that. So they discovered that those cables weren't encrypted, so they got full access to that. And you can see, if you can see carefully there, there's a little smiley face. Whoever discovered that was very happy. They wrote a little smiley face on there. So, they have a sense of humor at NSA, I guess. And then there's metadata, which nobody ever heard of until basically Snowden came out, and then everybody's heard of metadata. That's just the to and from, the little information on the cables, or little information on the internet that says when something was sent and to whom and it was sent and from whom it came from. And NSA has been collecting that from all Americans ever since 9/11. Every time I make a phone call, all that data, it goes to NSA. So if it's coming from the US, you can believe that they're doing it in countries like Lebanon or any place else where there are no restrictions on it. So picking up metadata, who you're calling, who you're sending emails to, that all gets stored by NSA. So you're talking about enormous amounts of information here. The question is, what do you do with it? Where do you put it all? I write for do cover stories occasionally for Wired, and I did one on the data center that NSA is building. It's the biggest data center in the world, 1 million square feet, and that's where they're going to put it all. It's in this little town of Bluffdale, Utah. And the only other thing in Bluffdale, Utah is so it's one of these offshoots of the Mormon religion. So they have this polygamy center there. So you have the secret NSA people and the polygamists all in the same area. And the NSA is listening for signals from space, and the polygamists are listening for their own messages from the heavens, I guess. But they're all in this one little town of Bluffdale. I was there a few months ago. It's really rather funny. But that's where it's all getting stored. They put it all in there and store it for long periods of time. And so if you ever, your computer ever crashes, just get in touch with NSA. They've got a duplicate copy there someplace in their facility at Bluffdale. Okay, so now you've collected it and you've stored it. But how are you going to go through it all? Well, they've figured that out too. They've got this new computer they're building in Tennessee at Oak Ridge. That's where they were, one of the areas where they worked on the atomic bomb in World War II, the Manhattan Project, the big secret Manhattan Project. Now this is basically a Manhattan Project for the biggest, not atomic bomb, but the biggest computer ever created by human beings. It'll do 1 quintillion operations a second. That's a billion operations a second. In other words, in the time it takes you to blink your eye, it'll do a billion operations. So if you're trying to go through billions and billions of communications and billions of emails and billions of phone calls, you need something that will do a billion operations a second. So it'll be huge. It's going to take up several warehouses there, the size of the computer. And it'll be hot because, just your laptop, if you keep your laptop on your lap, it gets warm. Well, this will get very warm. And the amount of cooling power they'll need to cool this computer will be, they estimate it to be about the same amount of cooling power it took to cool both towers of the World Trade Center. And in terms of the amount of power it will use, they figured it will use about the same amount of power it takes to power the entire city of Baltimore, Maryland. So you're talking about an enormous computer here. But that's what NSA needs to go through all this information. And NSA is continually going through, they just never stop. They keep going through lots of information. The latest thing is this thing called Project Mystic, which they're trying to figure a way to eavesdrop on all the cell phones in every country. Everybody's cell phone. I mean, not just targets, but everybody's cell phone. So they started out with the Bahamas. And they succeeded. They were able to actually eavesdrop on every single phone call in the Bahamas. There's a big center for terrorism down there. We have to worry about all these terrorists coming from Bahamas, selling us rum or something. They've got 3 more countries that they've managed to completely get all the cell phone coverage out of. Again, every single one. So that's the NSA's goal. The NSA's goal is they don't have these small targets. They're very big targets. So the question comes, do you get too much information? How much is too much? And one way is by doing sort of a analysis. And here are the misses. The misses are the first World Trade Center attack, the attack on the Uss Cole. Believe it or not, I actually was in the NSA the day that happened. I was invited to meet with the director, and he was the one who told me about that, but he didn't know about it beforehand, like everything else. That was a big surprise to General Hayden, the attack on the Cole. The attacks on the U.S. embassies in East Africa. NSA had no clue. 9/11, as I mentioned, they saw that on the CNN, just like the rest of us. The attempted bombing in Times Square, they had no clue, even though the person was communicating back and forth to Pakistan about that. The underwear bomber, even though the guy was learning all his how to do this in Yemen, and the Yemen was a big target, and his father had actually told the CIA he went into the embassy in Nigeria, and his father, because his son was becoming radicalized, and he told the CIA there that his son had become radicalized and had gone to Yemen. And anyway, they had all these clues, but they still never pulled it together. And then, of course, the Boston Marathon bombing, even though the Russians had told the Americans that these guys were people you should keep an eye on, they never did. So they're spending all this time eavesdropping on probably me and lots of other people, and they're missing all the real targets. But you know, they're managed to get everybody in Bahamas, so we feel comfortable about that. And here's the successes. You know, after the Snowden release, they came out and they said, look, there's been 54 times that we've been able to stop all these attacks and all that. Well, by the time it came that they actually had to hold their hand up and swear, you know, to tell the truth before the Congress, it came down to one, just one success. And that one success was actually some taxi driver in San Diego who sent $8,000 to some group in Somalia. You know, I mean, thank God they found that out, you know. That was all we got out of all that what I've just been showing you there. That's it. I actually I gave a talk about a month ago at a law school in Tennessee, and one of the other people that was speaking on the panel was the former deputy director of NSA, Chris Inglis, whose quote I have here. So he was rather embarrassed when I had to point out this was his quote, that was all they got out of it. He didn't get his reception was not overly warm down there for some reason. Anyway, that was all NSA got to show for all that work that they put in terms of eavesdropping. So what's next? The future of NSA. NSA's future, they're going from mass surveillance to digital imperialism. It's known as cyber warfare. And NSA is going, you know, they never go into anything small. They're going into it really big. I'm doing a documentary on this for PBS. It'll come out later this year. And one of the things was I interviewed Snowden about it, because Snowden, that's actually what his last job was, working for the NSA. He was a cyber warrior. So it was really fascinating having an on-camera interview with Snowden about his job as a cyber warrior. And you know, what people in the United States don't even have any idea that we now have a cyber army, we have a cyber navy, we have a cyber air force, and we even have cyber marines. So we have an entire cyber military now that's run by the Cyber Command. And guess who's in charge of Cyber Command? It's the director of NSA. So he's really the most powerful intelligence person that's ever existed. I mean, he's in charge of the biggest intelligence agency on Earth and the most intrusive intelligence agency, and he's in charge of the Cyber Command, which actually has the power of launching a war. And you can see by this is some of the literature they hand out. There's one common denominator in all that. It's the word dominance, because that's the whole idea. The whole idea is to dominate the internet, dominate cyberspace. To the Navy, cyberspace is just another ocean, you know, where they're going to put their battleships and take command. And the Air Force, just like space and just like you know, the airspace and real space, the cyberspace, they're going to command just like they command the other domains. So the U.S. is going full speed at creating an enormous cyber command, more than any other country in the world. So as I mentioned, Keith Alexander is in charge. He's the commander of Cyber Command as well as the director. Well, actually, he was. He just left a few months ago. But he was the director of NSA and the commander of Cyber Command. You know, interesting. I got a picture here of this chair. He sort of has this complex. I think he wanted to be in the Star Trek movies or something, because he actually had this chair made where he sits in it so he could command you know, the cyber world. Those are the kind of people you have running the cyber command. Now, as I said, this is a way to actually launch wars. People don't really realize it, but we've actually launched, just like we launched the first nuclear war, we launched the first cyber war. I mean, you hear all the time people being attacked, cyber attacks. Sony, you know, they knocked off a few computers and put some things online and things like that. That stuff happens all the time. What doesn't happen is using cyber to actually destroy physical objects. That's new. That just doesn't really happen. In other words, destroying something, destroying a physical object. Before, all you'd talk about when it was cyber would be blanking out a hard drive or something, or stealing data off a hard drive. Again, that's just cyber theft. Cyber warfare is different. You're actually destroying something. And the US did it with Stuxnet when they went into the plant in Iran, the Natanz nuclear enrichment plant, and they actually destroyed the 800 centrifuges. You know, it's very interesting because the NSA, it was a joint NSA, CIA, and Israeli operation. And the NSA and CIA told the president, Bush, and then Obama, you know, don't worry. Look, we're going to launch this. We'll destroy these centrifuges. Nobody's going to know. We're going to put the viruses in there. They're not going to go anywhere. They're just going to stay in the Natanz, and nobody will ever discover them. And even if they do discover them, they'll never know where they came from. Well, guess what? All that proved untrue. They put them in the plant. They managed to escape. They infected 100,000 computers around the world with that same virus. And you have these great cyber anthropologists who can take apart a piece of cyber code and tell you everything about it. Who made it, where it came from, what it's used for. So within about a few months after the thing escaped, everybody knew that the United States launched this attack against Iran. Well, Iran never had a cyber command before. And so after that, they decided to build their own cyber command, and they attacked the United States, one of our allied companies in Saudi Arabia, Saudi Aramco oil company, and they destroyed 30,000 computers, completely wiped the hard drives off of 30,000 computers. And then they turned their attention to US banks in New York. And they had these denial of service attacks that really disrupted things at the banks and the US couldn't stop it, despite the cyber command here. It couldn't stop it. Finally, the Iranians stopped it themselves. But that shows what happens. It's when you launch wars, there's usually response. It's what's called blowback, and that's what happens. So the United States launched the first cyber war, and it's probably not going to be the last. One of the things we're going to be able to show in our documentary is it's not just centrifuges. And by the way, there was 800 centrifuges. They replaced them in about 6 months, so it really did no good. I mean, it was useless anyway. You just buy new centrifuges. But we're able to show that you could actually take down an entire dam, one of the largest dams on Earth, using cyber warfare. Basically, cyber warfare, all it is getting some physical object to commit suicide. If something isn't supposed to go over 120 degrees, you get it up to 300 degrees. You're going to destroy it. If it's not supposed to vibrate, you get it to vibrate. Whatever it's not supposed to do, you get it to do that, and you're going to destroy whatever it is. That's what cyber warfare is, and that is next big thing to look for. So in order to do that, one of the ways NSA, in order to get into cyber warfare, one of the things is, this is another top secret slide from Snowden, is to create this thing that they call treasure map. Treasure map was, as it says right here, map the entire internet, any device, anywhere, anytime, including the ones you're sitting on right now. Every device, they want a map. So they want to get every device that's connected to the internet. And that's what you have to do. You have to, if you're going to do cyber warfare, you've got to know everything that's connected to the internet. And so in addition to that, what they have to do is they have to plant malware around the world. Because malware is sort of like sleeper agents back in the old days, where you actually put a sleeper agent someplace, and he may not be doing anything right now, but if you want him to, if you're all of a sudden getting into hostilities with the country, he could blow something up, or he can become a spy, whatever it is. Well, that's what this malware is, and that's what these little yellow dots are. This is, like I said, another top secret slide. And the yellow dots are CNE. It stands for Computer Network Exploitation. Now, what's interesting here is, they're not just in North Korea or Iran here. You can see Brazil, for example, is filled with them. They're filled with them in Europe, so you can be guaranteed that they're here in Lebanon. So the whole idea is you put these pieces of malware in key locations around the world. Now, they could be feeding back information, acting as a spy. That's what they do when they're in their normal state of being. But if you want, because all these are pieces of software, you just program them to be a piece of warfare. So you can actually program it to destroy something, just like it's stuxnets. So the idea was to plant these all over the world. And if you look at the slide, it says under CNE, basically 50,000 places around the world they planted these. So now you've got another operation. It's called Turbine. And Turbine is the next generation. It's to take what you just saw with those yellow dots and inject what it says millions of them. Again, this is another top secret slide. Inject millions of them into places around the world. So you've got to collect everybody's data, everybody's link to the internet, and then you've got to inject millions of these this malware into places all over the world. So anyway, that's cyber warfare. Finally, let me just wrap this up. So what are our protections, at least in the United States? You have no protections, so too bad. We do have protections. It's called the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. It's a top secret court. Even its location's top secret, although I usually slip and say it's on the third floor of the Justice Department building in Washington, or the federal courthouse in Washington. And it's a court that even the lawyers aren't even supposed to know really anything about. It never produces anything. It's a total top secret court, which is sort of something that Kafka might have written about. And nobody's ever actually seen the inside of the court, but I was able to get one picture from inside, and it's pretty interesting. There it is right there. So yeah, that's the FISA court. They're the ones that act as protections when presidents aren't going around it. But it's for a prosecutor, and I was a prosecutor once very briefly when I was in law school. It's sort of the dream court. Out of 33,900 surveillance requests made in 34 years, they just turned down 11 of them. So it's a pretty good record. And I can imagine how bad those 11 must have been. It must have been terrible. But if they turn them down, like those 11, they don't have to worry, because there's another very, very secret court, even more secret court above them. It's called the Foreign Intelligence Court of Review. And it's sort of the Maytag repairman of the federal judiciary, because they've only heard, I think, 2 cases in the last 35 years. But even if they turn them down, the government has a third bite at the apple. They can go to a directly to the Supreme Court for a in-camera, in other words, a secret session. So obviously the government's never been turned down, and they probably never ever will be turned down. So, but that's our protection there. But we do have, It's considered a rubber stamp, basically. But we do have another protection that we don't have to worry too much about. It's the Senate House Intelligence Committees. See, it's lucky they're behind closed doors when they have their sessions, so nobody really sees what's really going on back there. This is the fun I have is making these slides. So anyway, that's the problem we have. They didn't know about the foreign intelligence. They didn't know about the Bush administration going around the FISA court. They didn't know the Bush administration was doing warrantless surveillance. So they are really asleep at the job most of the time. And then we have our senior intelligence officials. And they have this little habit of lying to Congress. James Clapper, for example, was asked about whether NSA spies on millions of Americans. And he said, no, sir, not wittingly. I mean, I don't know how you don't do it wittingly when you're having your entire agency do it. Are they all asleep or something? So that was a lie. Nothing ever happened to him. And then Keith Alexander, when my article came out in Wired a couple of years ago about that data center, I had a number of whistleblowers that told me about NSA's eavesdropping domestically. This was before Snowden ever came out. And so Alexander was called before Congress, and he was asked the questions based on my article. Does NSA intercept American cell phone calls? No. Google searches? No. I mean, he lied directly right to Congress. And nothing ever happens to these guys. So that's why we really have to depend on the whistleblowers. They're the only ones that actually tell us the truth and tell us what's really going on. So these are the people that cooperated with me and that I really had a lot of respect for because they did cooperate and really appreciate it. So what's the takeaway here? Basically, you got this worldwide dragnet of NSA picking up all this communications, eavesdropping on all this information, and giving it to places like Israel and having them use it against other people like the Palestinians and so forth. So what can be done about that? I mean, there's very little actually. Nobody ever is doing anything. It is a violation of international law, however. I mean, if you actually read the this International Convent on Civil and Political Rights and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it's a violation of international law. And you can, sometimes it's difficult actually getting evidence, but one of the key pieces of evidence that could be used here is actually the incident involving Israel, because you actually do have the whistleblowers who are coming out and saying we were using that information for derogatory actions against the Palestinians, which is actually exactly what it says is not supposed to happen in these rules. So you can, if somebody out there wanted to take this up as a case, they could take a case take it to the international, one of the international tribunals and see what would happen. And then the other thing is to prosecute these people that continue to lie to Congress and continue to do these things. So sometimes, everybody has these dreams they always want to have happen, and here's one of mine right there. Keith Alexander, behind bars for doing some of these things that he's been doing. And sometimes that really works. When you put somebody behind bars, they do reform sometimes. And I think, if you did that with Keith Alexander, he'd come out and I think he'd find a reason to ask for amnesty for Snowden. Could happen, you never know. And then the other thing, last slide here is, like Robert said, I write a column for Foreign Policy Magazine. The one I had just came out last month was on using the intelligence community that collects all this information and does virtually no useful, protection. Use it for something useful, like I showed in the article how it could be used, very useful for things like Ebola, for example. We have all these satellites that are taking pictures. It could be very used too long to go into a little discussion here, but for example, one of the other things is they needed supercomputers to find what are the best cures for the disease. Supercomputers are really needed. Well, NSA has the biggest supercomputers in the world. So what the article is about creating what's known as a white center. In other words, a center where you're bringing a lot of that intelligence together for something useful as opposed to something just to harm people. And anyway, that's my spiel, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much for this
Oh, sure.
wonderful talk. And we do have, 15 minutes or so. If you have questions, I'd like to mic them so that we'll record them. If you have a question, we'll start with this gentleman over here.
So you use Gmail, right?
Yes. What can you do? I can't invent my own internet.
It's all right. So I want to ask about Palantir. If you have any idea about Palantir, the company. They started with In-Q-Tel, the investment arm of the CIA. So any idea where Palantir is in the game now, or?
Yeah, I haven't really kept track very much of Palantir, but I know it's one of those companies that is trying to monopolize on all the getting access. One of the interesting things is the outsourcing that NSA does. Before 9/11, NSA did everything in-house. And now it's these private companies that are doing all the work, like Palantir and a lot of the others. And they've created that, as you mentioned, that In-Q-Tel, which is a sort of hybrid between it's sort of a half government agency and half private industry. So the NSA has been getting heavily involved with using private industry to do everything. To do actually the actual interception, the eavesdropping, the analysis, the cyber warfare, everything. So you can see you have to go to these certain kind of websites that advertise for people in the intelligence community, and they actually advertise for cyber warriors and all that. Companies actually advertising for them. So, but yeah, I'm glad you're keeping an eye on Palantir. It's really useful to do that.
We have other questions?
One of the recurring, I guess, urban legends was that 9/11 was an inside job. Can you make a comment on that?
Well, I've written a book about it. I've done a documentary on it, and I probably know about as much as anybody about it at this point. Since one of my jobs is on the documentary was actually to follow their whole trail from that house in Yemen all the way to Kuala Lumpur, and then all the way to San Diego and all across the country. And I actually, I got one of the documents from it was a formerly classified document from the CIA that showed every stop they made. I know every phone booth they used, every motel they stopped in. So I've done a fair amount of research, and no, I don't think that there is any conspiracy. I think what you see is what there was. There were, people, I mean, what the common assumption is what happened. They came over here, they blew it up, and it wasn't the U.S. government or anything else, so they did it. So, no, I don't buy into the conspiracy theory.
Hello, thanks for doing this.
Sure.
We categorically see that for security purposes, the surveillance methods of the NSA can always seem to be surpassed. But when it comes to business interests, like in Brazil, for example, the NSA is used quite effectively. So do you think there's more of a business motive, perhaps, behind it than the way it's marketed as sort of a safety and security?
I actually testified on that issue before the European Parliament at one point. NSA doesn't do a lot of economic spying. I mean, it does macro spying in the sense that it'll look at Petrobras or whatever, the oil company in Brazil, to get a big sense for, like, maybe the Commerce Department, a big sense of the oil, maybe how it's going to be in the future. And it does eavesdrop on companies occasionally. In one of my books, Body of Secrets, I write extensively about them eavesdropping on a particular company in France. But again, it was doing it because the company was in violation of the, or at least appeared to be in violation of the embargo. But NSA doesn't really do they do the macro, as I said, but they don't go down to the individual level and give secrets to Boeing or whatever to help them with Airbus. I mean, the problem with NSA doesn't want to do that. NSA doesn't want to get anywhere near that because that means they have to let people, clear people they don't want to clear. They don't want to have people at Boeing who, are there for a couple of years, they go someplace else, know all of NSA secrets. And if they give it to Boeing, they have to give it to Lockheed, they have to give it to everybody else. So they don't do it that way. On the other hand, another way of looking at it, however, is that there is a lot of revolving door at NSA. So you have a lot of, as I mentioned, there's all this outsourcing to companies. So you have a lot of people in the industries now that have had associations with NSA or have worked for NSA. So you do bring this NSA knowledge to the companies, but that's a bit more nuanced than just passing secrets to them every day. So it's a little bit different, but I don't think NSA actually does give out daily reports. And if he's the director of NSA goes to the White House, the first question Obama or Bush was going to ask him isn't how much have you helped Boeing last week? It's have you found Osama bin Laden? So they don't want to spend a lot of their time doing things like that. So my opinion is that they aren't heavily engaged in economic espionage on the lower level.
Thank you very much for your talk. I was wondering
Sure.
if you could, based on you've done so much research, whether you could, whether you think that the ability, the technological ability to do this kind of spying, which is increasing, is its relationship to driving policy, like how policy decisions and the technological ability to do so, how do they balance out? And just another short, small question. Have you or anyone else who's done this kind of research on the NSA been asked to testify for the defense in any of the cases of people on trial for the failed attempts or for example, 9/11 or the Uss Cole, in terms of what sort of missed opportunities there?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. The role of technology is either as possibly a driver for policy, and it does work that way. For example, as I mentioned here with cyber, it was the intelligence community that went to the presidents, Bush and Obama, and convinced them that because we have this capability, you should use it. And so they did. They actually launched that Stuxnet attack. And it's the same way with the eavesdropping. NSA comes up with this, and then the policy says, okay, we should use this. So yeah, it's this, it keeps, the technology keeps driving this policy in ways that, that really a lot of people wish it wouldn't. But the problem is every time that the intelligence agencies like NSA goes to Congress and they say, look, last time we were here, we asked for money and we could do 50,000, we could plant 50,000 pieces of malware. Now with this new program, we could do 1 million, but we just need some more money. So that, these people in Congress think, oh wow, 50,000 then, 1 million next, sure, we'll give you some money. So yeah, a lot of this policy does get driven by technology. On the other question about working, yeah, I do have a law degree, and I do actually work on legal cases occasionally. So I did work on the Tom Drake case. Tom Drake was a senior official from NSA. He leaked some information to the Baltimore Sun about mismanagement and cost overruns at NSA. And they arrested him and charged him with 5 counts of espionage. So they pursued him for 4 years. He ran out of money after 2 years. He had to get a federal public defender. And the federal public defender hired me as the expert consultant, legal consultant. And so I was able to show, it took quite a while, but I was able to show that all the information they were charging him with in terms of this espionage case, leak case, all that information was in the public domain. But that wouldn't have really helped that much. I had to actually show that it was in the public domain because the government put it in the public domain. And we were able to show that everything they were charging him with was not only in the public domain, but the government put it in the public domain. So it was a really rare case where we went from 5 counts of espionage, 35 years in prison, down to a misdemeanor. It was less than a parking ticket. He had no jail time and no fine. And then the judge spent 20 minutes yelling at the prosecutor for even taking the case in the first place. So yeah, I do these things, and that's sort of the highlight of, I mean, there's never been a case that's been that successful, so I was really happy to be part of that one.
So we have time for a couple more questions.
Can you development of the algorithms that are going to sift through those vast haystacks of information? Because they're not just, what are they doing more than just like a search for the word jihad or something? What's the real artificial intelligence technique to ferret out what they want?
Yeah, good question. That computer I mentioned, that one in Oak Ridge, I mean, when you're attacking crypto systems, you want a number of things. First of all, you want some kind of backdoor if you can get it somehow. So the algorithm may be designed to attack an encryption system with a knowledge of a certain backdoor. There's another program I didn't mention here. It was called, what was it, Bull Run, Project Bull Run. And the whole idea of Bull Run was to work with go to the encryption companies and get them to weaken their encryption standards, and then not tell anybody, be secret about it. So the NSA and GCHQ are working very hard on that, Project Bull Run. Yeah, I wish I had time I would have showed you all about that. So the algorithms take into all kinds of these weaknesses, and so you can weaken encryption to a certain degree, and then you still have to do some brute force. That's what that big computer that does a billion operations is, brute force. It can attack, enormous combinations. So if you've already weakened the back end, and then you've attacked the front end with brute force, you can break that encryption. That's how they work those algorithms to some degree, I think.
Thank you. We have time for 1 or 2 more.
So near the end of your presentation, you mentioned how, in spite of all of this, the NSA really hasn't been doing too good of a job of keeping America safe. And I was wondering, in your opinion, if that's just because they have so much information it's almost useless, or because they're using it to track people like you or James Bamford or something.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the main thing is that just to back up, I mean, the point here is that this is not what NSA was created for. NSA, there's not slightest amount of idea what NSA was created for. It was created for one reason. It was created to find out whether Russia was going to launch nuclear missiles at the United States, to prevent another surprise attack by missiles. The problem was in 1991, when the Soviet Union ceased to exist and we became friends with Russia, NSA sort of ceased to have a purpose. It just didn't have a purpose anymore. We weren't looking for missiles from Russia anymore. I mean, they're still looking for, maybe North Korea or whatever, but the big mission disappeared. So NSA is looking for a new mission, and it latched on to you know, the mission at the time, which was counterterrorism. And the problem is it can't do counterterrorism. It's just not good at it. You could do the Soviet stuff very well, because Soviet naval communications and their Air Force communications, all those communications were on dedicated lines. All they had to do was eavesdrop on those, turn into those frequencies, and you're picking everything up. It wasn't really that hard. With terrorists, they're using cell phones in Zambia or whatever. They could be any place using any kind of methods. And so what do you got to do? You got to listen to everybody on Earth to try to find them. And then when you're trying to do that, you can't find them because you've got too much information. So that's the problem. Yeah. The problem is that they keep, every time they have a failure, then they go back to Congress and they say, you know, it was terrible, but you know, we have this idea. All we need is another $50 million, and we can buy this new piece of hardware, and we could collect more information, and this time we'll get it right. You know, so no, it just doesn't. It collects too much information to go through it all, and that's what this shows. Now, you know, I keep bad-mouthing NSA. On the other hand, NSA is the best agency, best intelligence agency in the world for collecting real intelligence, which is what it was supposed to do. You know, finding out what the North Koreans are doing, or finding out what the Chinese are doing, or whatever. I mean, it's the best intelligence agency in the world for doing that. The CIA is useless. But NSA is really good at that, and that's what they should do. That's what they should focus on, get away from this whole terrorism nonsense.
All right, we have time for one more question.
Thanks for your presentation. So a simple question, in your opinion, with these huge capabilities, why did they fail to stop attacks like 9/11 and others?
Why did it?
Why did fail to stop?
Yeah, obviously a really good question. It failed because of human error, human stupidity. First of all, General Hayden, who was in charge of NSA at the time, was petrified about having NSA do anything domestically. You have to understand the mentality before 9/11. At NSA, before 9/11, the biggest thing in the world was the Church Committee, and they took the director and they put him in front of the Congress in open session and just tore him apart for domestic eavesdropping. So Hayden wanted nothing to do with it. Matter of fact, when I interviewed him one time in his office before 9/11, he told me that there were, I think, 6 people that they were eavesdropping on in the United States. And they were mostly dual citizens and all that. So when the hijackers came, he wanted nothing to do with it because they were in the U.S., even though they knew that their communications were coming from them because they were communicating back to the house in Yemen. So that was one error. The one error was that NSA refused to share any of their information with the CIA, and then the CIA refused to share any of its information with the FBI, the fact that these guys were coming in with visas in their passports. Not only that, when they came into Los Angeles and they went down to San Diego, they were looking for a place to live, you know, to hang out. And so there was another Muslim that lived there. I mean, there were numerous ones, but they happened to meet this one. And he brought him into let him live in his house. You know, it was like a boarding, let him board in his house. It turns out the guy was an FBI informant. So here, they're living in a house owned by an FBI informant, and they're communicating back and forth to that house in Yemen that NSA's eavesdropping on. Because Khalid al-Midar's wife was pregnant, and he was very concerned about her, and he was calling her back and forth. And he actually quit at one point and flew back to Yemen to see her. Yeah, so there are all these mistakes, so many mistakes. I mean, I could be here for another half hour talking about them. So, So it was human error. It wasn't lack of information, it wasn't lack of intelligence, it wasn't lack of capability, and it wasn't lack of legal authority. They had all that. That's why all this post 9/11 stuff is just total nonsense. They had everything they needed pre 9/11, and they blew it because of human error. So anyway, good way to end this conversation. So.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you for